The first thing I noticed in Shanghai was how quiet the streets are now. Even though you see thousands of cars everywhere, streets that were once dominated by scooters and aging gas cars are now filled with small, practical electric cars. Most of them are not flashy. They don't have massive touchscreens or luxury branding. They're just made for commuting, grocery runs, short trips across dense cities. And many of them cost around $10,000. For an American, that number sounds made up. Because in the United States, electric vehicles are still framed as a premium product. Sleek, aspirational, and expensive. The average EV in the US sells for over $53,000, and even the cheapest new options like the Nissan Leaf, that's around $29,000. Or the Chevy Equinox EV is around $35,000. In Europe, more than 1 in 5 cars sold in 2024 were fully electric, and the best-selling models weren't luxury Teslas. They were compact EVs priced closer to 25 or 30,000 euros. Or let's look at South America. EV sales grew by over 60% year over year. In Brazil, electric vehicle sales jumped by more than 90% year on year, driven almost entirely by electric cars that were priced around $20,000 to $25,000 from Chinese companies like BYD and GWM. But hold up, if these electric cars exist and they're so cheap and they work well, then why can't Americans buy them? The answer has very little to do with tech, safety, or consumer demand. It's the result of a long chain of policy decisions, industrial strategy, and political fear that stretches back more than a decade. To understand why these cars exist at all, you have to rewind to the early 2010s. At the time, China faced an uncomfortable reality. It had become the world's largest auto market, but it had almost no globally competitive car brands, like none. Internal combustion engines were a dead end. Intellectual property, expertise, and brand power belonged to American, German, and Japanese companies. But electric vehicles offered something of a reset. And that's when China made a deliberate decision to treat EVs not as a niche consumer product, but as national infrastructure. Governments didn't just wait for the market to figure this out. They subsidized buyers, they poured money into battery research, gave manufacturers cheap land and long-term financing, and most importantly, they built charging networks years before there was the strong demand. So this wasn't just like a subtle policy, it was a short-term stimulus. In fact, it was even designed to absorb short-term losses in exchange for long-term dominance. See, by the mid-2010s, China had a problem that it could not ignore any longer: air pollution. Cities like Beijing weren't just polluted, they were visibly smothered in smog day after day. People were angry, parents were worried, and suddenly this wasn't an abstract environmental issue, it was like a political one. And that's when electric vehicles stopped being a nice future idea and started becoming a solution, not just for the industry, but for public health. At the same time, companies like BYD were scaling up fast. By the late 2010s, China wasn't experimenting with EVs anymore, it was producing them in the millions already. And once you hit that kind of scale, prices can fall, especially for batteries, which make up roughly 30 to 40% of an EV's costs. I mean, the more you build, the cheaper every unit becomes. China also made a very deliberate choice not to rely on anyone else. It didn't just assemble cars, it secured the entire supply chain, from lithium refining to battery cell manufacturing. And that control mattered because it locked in lower costs and insulated companies from global shocks. And by 2022, the results of all this were undeniable. China was producing more electric vehicles every year than the rest of the world combined. At that point, cheap EVs weren't the result of a breakthrough or a subsidy gimmick. They were the natural outcome of a decade-long bet on scale. Again, even if that meant losing money in the early years. Okay, so there's an often overlooked irony in all of this, and it's Elon Musk. In 2019, Tesla opened its Gigafactory in Shanghai. I mean, the factory was built in record time. And unlike almost every other foreign automaker, Tesla was allowed to operate without a Chinese joint venture. Elon repeatedly praised China's efficiency, regulatory speed, and manufacturing, and for good reason. China helped Tesla become profitable at a critical moment in its history. But there was an unintended consequence in that success. Tesla thrived in China not because China copied Tesla, but because Tesla plugged into China's existing systems. Batteries were cheaper, suppliers were clustered nearby, labor was flexible, logistics were streamlined. The factory wasn't fighting the ecosystem, it was benefiting from it. And that ecosystem was now producing its own cars. By the early 2020s, Chinese EV makers were doing something Tesla wasn't focused on, stripping EVs down to just basically their essentials, like smaller batteries, shorter ranges, and fewer features. This is counterintuitive, right? I mean, usually car companies should be thinking about giving you more. But the truth was, most drivers didn't need more. And so the result was an electric car that wasn't just aspirational, but it was affordable. And that idea alone posed a massive threat. See, for a long time, this didn't feel like a direct danger to the US. I mean, Chinese EVs were mostly just sold within China. They were compact, optimized for urban environments, and honestly seemed mismatched with American highways. But that assumption began to crack in 2018. And so as Chinese manufacturers improved build quality and quietly prepared to export, US policymakers started to realize this wasn't about luxury competition. It was about something else. Price. A Chinese EV didn't need to outperform a Ford or GM vehicle. It just needed to be good enough and much, much cheaper. And history offered a warning. The US had seen this movie before, with Japanese cars in the 1970s and South Korean cars in the 1990s. But this time, the stakes were higher. EVs aren't just another product category. They're the future of the auto industry. Europe hesitated. The US did not. During the US-China trade war, Section 301, tariffs created a legal and political foundation that could later be expanded to autos. And by the early 2020s, Washington had reached a quiet consensus. If Chinese EVs entered the US market freely, they would undercut domestic automakers before those companies had time to adapt. So instead of competing head-on, the US shut them out. In 2024, the US imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Officially, the move was justified as a response to unfair subsidies and national security concerns. But economically, the move was blunt and decisive. A $10,000 car doesn't become $12,000 under these rules. I mean, once you add tariffs, shipping, regulatory compliance, dealer margins, and profit, well, the entire value proposition of this cheap EV collapses. The car is just totally not competitive. And this is how modern protectionism works. You don't need to ban a product, you just need to make it totally economically irrational to sell. And actually, Europe offers kind of a glimpse of what the US is trying to avoid. As Chinese EVs entered European markets, they gained traction quickly. Not because European consumers suddenly trusted Chinese brands, but because, again, price. In countries with high fuel costs and generous EV incentives, affordability wins. European governments responded slowly, debating tariffs, while Chinese brands gained market share. And from Washington's perspective, this wasn't something to study, this was something to prevent. Then came the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, often described as America's most ambitious clean energy policy to date. And in many ways, it is. But its EV provisions are more restrictive than they first appear. See, to qualify for tax credits, electric vehicles must be assembled in North America, use batteries sourced from approved countries, and avoid materials from what the law calls foreign entities of concern. So in practice, that language almost entirely excludes China. So even if a Chinese EV somehow could clear tariffs, it wouldn't qualify for subsidies. American consumers would face a narrow set of options: either buy a more expensive domestic EV with incentives, or pay full price for an imported one without them. Now, all of this might seem bad to the consumer, and objectively it is, but the stated goal of these policies is to protect American jobs and American manufacturing. And in short term, they kind of succeeded. And in practice, these policies give US automakers some breathing room. They buy time to update factories, lock in battery suppliers, and manage the transition without being immediately undercut by much cheaper imports. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. The US didn't block cheap Chinese EVs because they were unsafe, it blocked them to protect American car companies, with the biggest company being Tesla. But here's the twist. Tesla sales are down. EV adoption in America is slowing, and in some months it's flat, in others it's falling. And the US is basically the only major market where this is happening. So at the same time the US blocked cheaper EVs from coming in, it also started pulling back EV subsidies. So prices stayed high, incentives shrank, and buyers quietly stepped away. So the protection froze the market right at a price that most people don't want to pay. If cheaper electric cars were available, more people would simply be buying EVs. Instead, the US is choosing a slower, more controlled transition that protects the domestic industry first, even if it delays widespread adoption. So when people ask, why can't Americans buy a $10,000 cheap Chinese electric vehicle, the answer isn't actually complicated. It's not about safety, it's not about tech, and it's definitely not because the cars don't exist. It's because the US made a conscious decision to protect its auto industry, even if that means higher prices, slower adoption, and fewer choices for consumers. You can argue either side of the US's policy, right? I mean, every country protects its industries in one way or another, but it's important to be clear what is actually happening. As long as the US keeps blocking cheap imports to protect domestic automakers, electric cars in the US are going to stay expensive. And once you see it that way, the $10,000 Chinese EV isn't a mystery anymore. It's just something Americans don't have access to, and that's all by design. I want to know what you think about all this below. Let me know, and while you're at it, make sure you subscribe to this channel. I'll see you in the next one.